Welcome to Codex, a history of video games. I'm Mike Coletta.
And I am Tyler Osby.
And today we're going to continue our conversation with Final Fantasy. Tyler, take it away.
Oh my goodness. We're going to talk about Final Fantasy for so long here. All right. So we covered, this is our part 3. So we covered 1 through 6 in the first part. And then we covered just 7 in part 2 because there's a lot of games surrounding the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. And now we're back on the main track. Today we're going to cover Final Fantasies 8 through 10. Originally I thought, oh, we can do 8 through 12 today. And then I got really far into writing the notes for this and I was like, oh, there's a lot here. We're going to have to continue breaking this up even further. So let's talk about 8 here.
Ooh, this is the one I know.
Oh, great, because maybe you know a little bit more about it than I do, because I played this one briefly, but I kind of did some cheesy exploit stuff to make it really easy for me, so I didn't get the real experience, you know?
Well, the real experience was me not finishing the game, so maybe you do know more than I do. I think I got to the beginning of the 3rd disc, and I got stuck, and then I was just like, I battled like the same boss 3 or 4 times in a row and just kept dying. Mm-hmm. And I mean, already as a kid, you have a low attention span. And I was just like, whatever, I'll come back to it. And then I just never came back to it. So.
Yeah, I've been there. I do that with Final Fantasy games all the time. I've played 10 hours into World of Final Fantasy twice now. And I probably could be done with that game if I just didn't start it over when I went back to it. But, you know.
Dude, I'm a big fan of all things Final Fantasy VIII, though. Like, I was really super into it. I liked the whole concept with like the seed and garden and gun blades. So I'll let you go.
Oh,
but yeah,
gun blades.
I'll put my chime in later.
Gun blades are great. I'm glad that they're starting to become more of a staple of the Final Fantasy franchise, because like 8 did it, and then 13 had gun blades in it, and now there's a new class in Final Fantasy 14 called the Gunbreaker that's all gun blades. I love it.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So, okay, let's take a step back here and look at Square's first follow-up to Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII. Makes sense. 8 comes after 7. A lot of people at the time were expecting to catch up with Cloud and the gang and move forward with their lives, but what they got was something completely different. This wasn't surprising to Final Fantasy veterans, of course, but it was pretty surprising to the legions of new fans that Final Fantasy VII had brought into the fold. People were like, what? Where's Cloud? Where's Tifa? Where are my people? Why are this on a different planet? And all that stuff. And they were a little bit disappointed, but I think if they chose to move on and get past that initial disappointment, they would find a pretty decent game here. So once Final Fantasy VII was done and in English localization, the team began work on Final Fantasy VIII. They knew they had a decent hit on their hand at this point, and there was zero chance that Final Fantasy VIII was not going to be made. Sakaguchi remained the game's producer, and both this and Spirits Within he did at the same time.
2 producing jobs at the same time? That seems very complex and confusing.
Double producing. One of the things that I think permeates Final Fantasy VIII is like this really realistic aesthetic. They kind of threw out the designs of Final Fantasy VII and just focused on keeping things more realistic. I think they wanted the whole game to feel like the battle scenes and cutscenes of Final Fantasy VII, so they left the hoof hands behind.
No one leaves the hoof hands behind.
Yeah, I still look at that game and I go, was this an artistic choice or was it a technical choice? Because I can't see the artistic value in hoof hands, but also in Final Fantasy VIII, they would prove that they didn't need to do that at all. So I just don't get it.
Yeah, I don't get it either. I am going to make you a t-shirt that says no one puts hoof hands in the corner. So
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Final Fantasy VIII was released in Japan in February of 1999 and September of 1999 in the US, and then in October of Europe, just 2 years after Final Fantasy VII. This one also was released on PCs in early 2000, and it actually came out on PC in the United States before it came out in Japan. So we're getting stuff ahead of time sometimes.
Yay! Here comes North America.
Yeah, we're crushing it now. On a structural level, Final Fantasy VIII is the same as any other Final Fantasy up to this point. There's a world map, there's city maps, dungeon maps, and there's a battle system. They don't change a whole lot, except for all of the non-battle scenes use the good-looking models, like I said before. No more hoof hands. The battle system, though, they kept the active time battle system that had now been standard for several games. But they changed up a lot of key things. So instead of mixing and matching materia, like in Final Fantasy VII, to customize your characters, players would assign guardian forces to each member of their party. Guardian forces are like summons in previous Final Fantasy games, even going so far as actually to be the summons from older Final Fantasy games. After junctioning a guardian force to a character in the player's party, that character would gain access to magic and a bunch of other stuff that like the guardian force could do. Speaking of which, Square decided to remove magic points from the game entirely, instead having magic spells be kind of like an inventory item, although each character had their own spell inventory to cast from. So spells were drawn from either draw points on the map or from enemies, and it was a little weird because there was like a sort of farming aspect that you had to do. Like if you knew you really liked the spell and wanted a whole bunch of them, you'd have to like go to wherever it is that you get that and like sort of grind to make sure you had enough to get you through whatever you were trying to get through.
Maybe that's a mistake I made.
Did you not do any magic?
I didn't grind the game at all. Like I just played it like a kid. Like I just kept going along with the story, you know?
Yeah. Well, and Final Fantasy VIII had some weird incentives as far as grinding goes too, which I'll talk about in a minute when I talk about how I cheesed the game.
Talk about that tasty cheese, that tasty Final Fantasy cheese.
That tasty Gouda cheese. So spells could also be junctioned to different stats, sort of making this like create your own class system that was pretty fun. And it kind of opened the doors to a lot of strategies and other character customization. So you would junction a guardian force and then you would junction magic spells to your various stats. And so you would try to either create synergies with the guardian force you were linked up with, or maybe cover your weaknesses, stuff like that. You had a lot of choices. Battles are entered the same way as every single Final Fantasy game up to this point, randomly on the world map or on the dungeon map. After winning a battle, the character gains both experience and AP, which I think is maybe ability points. XP levels up the character themselves, and then AP levels up the Guardian, which grant you access to further abilities that like upgrades Guardian, gives you all kinds of cool stuff. They brought limit breaks back.
I'm trying to find my favorite Guardian right now, just so everyone knows. Okay, that's what I'm working on, so I can share later.
Yes, I'm very interested in what your favorite Guardian Force is. I didn't do too much with the Guardian Force systems because like I said, I cheesed it, and so there was one specific one I was going for, and then I just leveled that up heavily. So I didn't really try any of the other ones. But they brought limit breaks back from Final Fantasy VII, and they're pretty much unchanged. They're like almost exactly the same. Each character has their own. They all have a little mini game that happens when you use the limit break, and they're super fun. They're like cool ultimate abilities. I think these systems are all pretty neat and offered a lot of customization. Unfortunately, there are a few ways to totally abuse the system and use it to your advantage to make the game super easy, which is what I did, which is why I think I had like a not great experience. So basically what happens is when you level up in Final Fantasy VIII, all of the enemies become harder. They also level up. So the player is like almost rewarded for not leveling up, which creates a weird set of incentives where I tried to avoid experience as much as possible in the early game until I got a Guardian Force called Diabolos. I then leveled Diabolos up enough with some other trickery that made me not gain any experience, but only AP. And so this would enable his ability to turn off random encounters, which made the game super fast and much easier to do without getting XP. Also, bosses don't give you experience points in this game. So you can, once you have encounter none from Diabolos, you gain a no XP for the rest of the game. There is also a few other weird. Yeah, there's also a few other exploits in the draw system that meant I could be hitting like super low level enemies for maximum damage. There's like some triple triad stuff going on there where you can turn cards into spells, and then you can get some really powerful spells early on that you shouldn't be able to get, and then junction them to like your attack skill or your strength, and then you're just hitting 999 at like level 5, and it's pretty easy. So I'm pretty sure that I was under level 10 when I finally finished the game, which the game doesn't expect you to be at all, and so like the super underleveled final boss is really easy. When my brother played it back in the day, like when it was actually kind of a new game, he didn't know about the enemies getting harder as you leveled. So when he got to the final boss, he's like, oh, well, I'm just going to grind it out. And he kept grinding it out, and it kept being super hard. So he was like, you know what? Screw it. I'm getting it to level 100. So he grinded all the way to level 100, and he just continued making it harder for himself. He did eventually beat the game because he's a champion at JRPGs, and I admire him for this, but it was very hard.
I think your brother, everyone knows, is legendary by now for beating JRPGs.
He is legendary at JRPGs for sure. This guy played through all of Dragon Quest VIII on his cell phone, which is pretty impressive.
Yeah, for a cell phone game, too.
Yeah.
Okay, I found a list of Guardian Forces. So, and this is how you know how basic I am. I only remember the default ones. Like, I think the only one I actually got, which is why it was my favorite, is my Ifrit. Ifrit was my favorite.
Uh-huh.
He lived in a fire cavern, and it was not far from Balam Garden. So I think I didn't know any of the secrets, and I didn't look anything up, and I just followed the story. So I bet you all these other ones, I never ran into Diablos.
Yeah, I forget how you get Diablos, but I had to go out of my way to
a magical
do a thing.
lamp. You got to get an item called Magical Lamp, and then when you use the item, you're transported to a battle with Diablos, and if you beat him, he joins your party.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm looking at all of them right now. Like, I really liked Quetzalcoatl. But that was like Squall's default.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think I unlocked Ifrit, and then I used Ifrit the entire game because he would like throw a giant fire boulder down on your enemy.
Sweet.
It was pretty cool. Yeah,
nice.
big fan of this game and Gunblades. And what's Squall's like nemesis's name? The guy that is it
Cypher. That cuts his face.
Yeah.
Gives him a sweet scar.
Yeah, that was great. It was a really intense opening, that game. They're like battling with gunblades, and then they're like, oh, they're just dueling at the Balam Garden where they train, you know?
Yeah, they're just sparring, but Squall was permanently maimed.
Mm-hmm. Wow, he's so rude, that Cypher. I want to say Scyther because he's a Pokemon.
Which could also slash your face and give you a big scar, probably.
Yeah, but you wouldn't be mad at it because it's just doing its thing. It's just a Pokemon. That's how Pokemon live.
Yeah,
you know?
especially Scythers.
That's right.
Yeah. One other cool thing that Final Fantasy VIII introduced that would be continued into the next Final Fantasy game, but they kind of wouldn't do it anymore, is, mini games would be continued in other Final Fantasy games, but this one specifically had a card game, and the card game was called Triple Triad. I don't want to get into the details of how it works, but it was pretty fun. It's fairly simple and fairly addictive, and it also has some big rewards if you get good at it. So it's worth checking out if you're into the game. And like I said, it also sort of fed into the exploit that I was talking about earlier. So in the early game, you can access a certain card from a certain enemy, and you can then draw spells from that card and then junction them to your stats. So you end up just hitting super hard. Early game, it's lame. So,
oh, wow. Yeah, I remember this game this card game.
It's fun, though. The game itself is pretty fun. Yeah. And I'm kind of surprised that it doesn't really exist in any other form. I think you can play it in Final Fantasy XIV in the MMO, but I've never really done it before. So, I don't know. I'll have to check that out.
It seems like this whole game, Final Fantasy VIII, should just be called Cheese. Final Fantasy Cheese Edition.
Final Fantasy Cheese Edition. The story of Final Fantasy VIII concerns the members of a mercenary group called... it's Seed. It's written SEED, but the last D is also capitalized. So is it Seed or is it CD? I don't know.
I don't know. And I always was wondering that. I have no idea how you're supposed to say it.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
I always called it Seed.
Yeah, I think that's probably correct. Seed. Anyway, they've been sent out to help some rebels free themselves from Galbadia, which is a large empire that's looking to take over the world. So this is pretty standard Final Fantasy. At the start, you follow a group of trained fighters: Squall Leonhart, the only Final Fantasy protagonist more emo than Cloud; Renoa Hartley, his love interest; Quistis Treep, who is an instructor at their school for orphan mercenary children; Cypher Almasi, Squall's rival, and the one that gives him that badass scar, like we said. Laguna Luar is a guy who nobody really knows about, but he has a dark and mysterious past that gets revealed as the story goes on. You got Selphie Tilmet and Zell Dinkt. They're also students at Balam Garden, where all these guys hang out. And then you got Irvine, who's a sniper, and gets a really cool cutscene, at the end of the first or second disc. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, who doesn't love a cool cutscene?
I love a cool cutscene. So the story starts out fairly simple, but in true Final Fantasy fashion, unravels into a planet-threatening catastrophe that ends up killing probably a god at the end. You always end up killing a god at the end. The story touches on really heavy themes like war and the cost on not only those who die during the war, but also those who live. Most of the main characters were orphaned during a great war that happened 20 years before the events of the game. And so now they're members of a mercenary unit that perpetuates wars. So they are a member of the machine that caused them to be orphans, which is a weird juxtaposition and something interesting to think about. There's a lot of truths that get revealed on the way, and then the heroes save the day. Spoiler alert, whatever. The game,
Spoilers, Tyler.
I know.
Spoilers.
The good guys win. Spoilers. The game received a lot of positive reviews on release. There were some folks, like I mentioned, that were caught off guard by the fact that it wasn't a Final Fantasy VII continuation. But once people got past that, I think they mostly really enjoyed it overall, especially if you didn't know about like ways of making the game super easy. I think it did have a compelling system that was fun to customize. It sold really well, but it didn't have much in the way of sequels or anything like that. Square hadn't even started the whole compilation of Final Fantasy VII stuff yet. They wouldn't release a game in that set until like well after Final Fantasy X was out. So they were when they did compilation of Final Fantasy VII, they were out almost digging in the archives there. It was like kind of an old game at that time. So, but at this point, they were focused on creating single game experience, and that continued on to Final Fantasy IX.
Yeah, now I'm back to having no knowledge.
This is one that I haven't played, really. I've played a little bit of it, but I want to get into it and really finish this one out. So Final Fantasy IX was the last one on the PlayStation 1 and the last Final Fantasy game that had a single digit for its name. So it's Final Fantasy IX. We'd come so far since the last-ditch effort that was the first Final Fantasy, and now we're going to celebrate. And what better to celebrate than to take a ton of stuff from old Final Fantasies and make a new game that takes the awesome stuff from the old games and blends it with the high production value and the modernization that the newer games have. Enter Final Fantasy IX. At this point, Square was so sure that they had a hit on their hands with Final Fantasy VIII that they didn't even bother finishing that game before starting on the next one. And they weren't wrong. Final Fantasy IX was able to be released just a little more than a year after Final Fantasy VIII. Sakaguchi called this his perfect Final Fantasy game that took everything that made the old games great and mixed it with everything that made the new games great, and he was very happy with it. The game broke a bit from Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII into a little more of a fantasy-fueled, lighthearted game. It takes place in kind of a steampunky medieval setting like the older games, which meant that a ton of the old classes were back, and I love it. I still need to play this game.
So what like when you say like the old classes were back? You know what those are?
So they had so 7 and 8 sort of had classes from the older games, but they weren't really spoken about. But 9...
Oh, you mean like mages and stuff like that, right?
Yeah. So 9 really went in on like Cloud doesn't have a specific class, but if you give him certain materia, you can kind of make him be a specific sort of class. And 7 didn't call them out specifically. 8 doesn't call them out specifically either. It has a sort of similar amount of customization, but 9 has Zidane is a thief, so he's gonna be doing thievy stuff. Vivi is a black mage, so he's gonna be doing black mage stuff, and so on and so forth, stuff like that.
Nice. I like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Give him a job.
Yeah, it's nice. I appreciate the customization, and it probably worked for the stories of Final Fantasy VII and VIII. I also appreciate when a character has a specific job, because then you can make the story about that too. Like, we'll get to it in Final Fantasy X, but Yuna being a summoner in Final Fantasy X is a huge part of the story, and if you could just change her to be something else, it would be weird. So she has to be a summoner for the whole game.
Totally. Gotcha.
Yeah. So the story follows Zidane and his group of ragtag misfits as they try to save the planet from a queen being led by an evil dude that's building an army of black mages. Her daughter, the princess, escapes fairly early on. Actually, you're going there to kidnap the princess, and when you get there, you find out the princess is trying to get out. So she's just like, okay, cool, let's go. So she just joins you pretty early on.
Instant Stockholm syndrome.
Yeah. So she'd been planning her escape for a while, and then these people show up and they're like, we're taking you. And she's just like, okay. So, of course, the army of black mages isn't the real problem, and in classic Final Fantasy form, you end up needing to save the entire planet from a god, always fighting the godlike beings by the end of these Final Fantasy games. Just
where do they keep coming from? These godlike beings keep coming out of the woodwork.
I know, and it's in this one too, it's especially weird because it's like you sort of fight the main baddie for the thing, and you beat him. It's like, oh yeah, you beat the main baddie, and then all of a sudden, just this other boss just appears out of nowhere, and you're just like, well, I guess we got to fight this guy now. It's like,
dude, I kind of like strange. It when then bosses do that. When you're like, oh, you killed the boss. Just kidding, that's another boss.
Yeah. So the gameplay takes the standard Final Fantasy fare and really just continues to refine it. It's still active time battle. You're still taking turns with the enemy, hitting each other. This game calls its summons Eidolons, which is a callback to Final Fantasy IV, which also called Rydia's summons Eidolons. Speaking of callbacks, this game is full of them. If you're a Final Fantasy game, if you are a Final Fantasy fan, which I am, so I don't know why I haven't played this yet, the game is chock full of references and like fun little in-jokes.
If you're a Final Fantasy game, how are you listening to this podcast?
Yeah.
It's terrifying.
That's even more impressive. And if you are a Final Fantasy game, please send an email to codexhistorypodcast@gmail.com.
If you're a self-aware Final Fantasy game, what's happening?
So the character customization in 9 is strangely limited, but also very open at the same time. So every character has a class, like I said, and that's just what they are. There's no job system or anything like that. The way they learn new skills, though, is from items and armor. So whenever you get a new piece of gear, you have to check it to see what moves are on it. If it's an ability you like, then you equip that piece of gear, and then when you earn enough XP while wearing that piece of gear, it will eventually make that ability permanent. So you go through the game gathering abilities, and then by the end, you've got like every ability in the game, and it's like sounds super fun.
I really like that system because it like teaches you how to use it, and then at a certain point, it's like, okay, now you can just have this because you know what you're doing and get a new one. It's like it naturally progresses it.
It's cool, and I think you get gear at such a pace that like you're never quite done learning an ability by the time a new piece of gear pops up, which makes you go, okay, do I want to stick with this gear that I have that's maybe worse but has this ability that I like, stick with it long enough to learn the ability, or do I just ditch it altogether and go with this thing that is clearly better right now? And so you have to make some trade-offs, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, make me make choices, hard choices. I like
that. So FF9, like its predecessor, has a card game in it. This one was called Tetramaster, and it played differently from Triple Triad. I don't know anything about how Tetramaster is played, and I won't pretend to, but they learned their lesson this time around, and Tetramaster is completely separate from the rest of the game. You don't get anything from playing Tetramaster other than more cards to keep playing Tetramaster with. So they really went in on Tetramaster because they released it later, a few years later in 2003 as its own standalone product that was played online and had a monthly fee like Final Fantasy XI did, which I always thought was really interesting. I was like, who is paying a monthly fee to play this card game that wasn't even that good? I don't know.
Yeah, that's wow. Yeah, I don't know who decided to make that choice.
Yeah, and it went on until 2010 when they finally decided to turn it off. So
again, the one guy that's he's only playing Tetramaster for 7 years, and he finally gets to play another game. And he's like,
we'll invite him to the Jaybird tournament.
Oh, yeah, you're welcome to come to the Jaybird tournament. Master.
So this game was infamous for its strategy guide. So back in these days, you got to remember this is the year 2000, before the internet had everything you could ever want as far as game guides go. Although it did have a lot of stuff. But remember back in the day when you used to have to buy books that would tell you where all the secrets were? Remember that?
Oh, man, I love that.
Yeah. And
if
in
I
Final
got a
Fantasy
game and
games,
I got a book, I got so excited about it.
Yeah, for sure. And in Final Fantasy games, there's like a ton of secrets, so you really wanted to get the guide when you got the game. So the FF9 guide, though, was created at a time where the world was still trying to figure out the internet and what all we could do with it. So this game just decided it would be half and half, which meant that the guide you paid for was constantly telling you to go to Square's internet site, which had the actual information you were looking for. The guide was no good without the internet, and the internet content was no good without the guide. So hopefully you had access to internet while you're playing your offline single-player RPG in the year 2000, or you were going to have a bad time with the guide. What's even funnier is none of that online content is still online. So if you have the guide, it's even more useless today than when it came out.
That's amazing. That is the weirdest marketing choice I have ever heard in my entire life. We're going to put our book that you pay for half in the book and then half online. I would be so mad.
Yeah, people were so mad.
By the way, fun little side note here. I found out today that two of my good friends play Skyrim and they bought the book. They still have these. They have the full Skyrim special edition book, and it is huge. They showed me. It's like a dictionary.
I wouldn't want that anymore because the way games are like patched and updated now, it's like this book is out of date. Like I have the book for Final Fantasy XI and it had a lot of cool stuff in it. 100% useless now because all that stuff is different because they changed and updated it.
That it's the special edition, so by now they know where everything is. You know?
Yeah, that's true.
It's not going to change too much. But definitely if it was like the first Skyrim, I wouldn't have bought the book.
Yeah.
Like right when Skyrim came out, there's no way.
Yeah, because it's probably all different now.
Totally.
Yeah. So, all right. Overall, while I wouldn't say that Final Fantasy IX had a huge impact on future entries in the series, it was this like really sweet, gigantic love letter to everything that had come before. And I think it was the perfect way to send the series off as it headed into the next generation of consoles. I still think of the PS2 and the Xbox and the GameCube as next generation, even though they're all like 20 years old now. I think that's because this was the first time in my life that I like could see ahead to a console release and like get excited for it. Like I hadn't had that before in my life. So
oh yeah, totally. I mean, I remember the N64 when that was the new thing, and that felt amazing. But that Xbox PS2, that was the first like kind of console wars time, you know, where people were like, no, the PS2 is way better than Xbox.
Yeah,
you know,
I would say that was like the height of the console wars. Was definitely, and at least in my life, because that was the period of probably the last period of time in my life where I would definitely not be able to afford having all three consoles. Because by the PS3 and the Xbox 360, like I had a job and stuff so that I could like budget and own more than one. But like when you only have one console, you have to defend that because you need everybody to know you're just as cool as them, even if you're not playing the same games.
Yeah, you're like, I made the right choice, okay?
Yeah.
By the way, I fully noted that now, of course, there's still console wars now, but as a adult, I just don't really care. That's what I'm trying to say.
I just
like,
don't care. Yeah.
Some people still are like, oh, you got an Xbox? Trash. And I'm like, I don't care. I bought the console my friends are on. Like that's what you do now. It's not even about what's the good one. It's what console does your friends have.
I just want to play whatever everybody else is playing. And also, why are we making this weirdly like a attack on my character because of the console I chose to buy? I just want to play some video games.
I know, right? Me too. That's what I feel. I just want to play all of the video games. Oh, man. There were so many kids on my flight coming back yesterday that had Switches. I was so jealous. And then I pulled out that Pikachu Nintendo DS.
Yeah.
We'll get to that later. Okay.
Yeah. Someday I'll play Final Fantasy IX. But not today.
So what is it? What can you play it on now?
Oh, it came out on PS1. You can buy it on PS3 as a PlayStation Classic. It's on iOS, Android, Steam. I think you could get it on Apple TV. You can get it on like Android TV. You can play it on pretty much everything. It's on Switch also, so you can play it everywhere.
Oh wow! I'm really considering the iOS versions of the game. You know,
Yeah.
I'm really starting to consider that to being the way to play because I think it would be fun to play these games, especially if they're not technically demanding, just while chilling. You know, hanging out.
Yeah.
On like a tablet or something.
Yeah, they're still really like it's still hard for me to buy like a $20 phone app, even though I know it's a full game that has 4 discs worth of content. It's still like weird to me.
Oh yeah, there's something that I did last week that I got figured out that's changed how I play games a little bit. And I want to talk about that later. And it hasn't changed it yet. It's going to.
Okay. All right.
That's for later segment. Little tease. Little tease.
All right. Well, let's then move on to our third game of the day, Final Fantasy X. This one's in my top 3 Final Fantasies, which also includes what?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. You go ahead. I cut you off.
This is in my top 3, which also includes Final Fantasy VII and, controversially, Final Fantasy XIII. Love that game. Sorry, what were you going to say?
Ooh, hot take coming from Tyler. I was going to say that this is the Final Fantasy I remember coming out. Yeah, this one is the one I remember coming out, and my friend being like obsessed with the just guy in the water. Like, I remember this cover with the blonde guy in the ocean with the sword.
Yep.
Oh yeah, I never played this game, but it looks like, and this had a lot of remake things too, right?
Yeah, it came out on PS3 and PS4, and it's on PC, and it's on Switch, and it's on everything.
Oh, cool! I could play it on computer.
Yep, totally can. So at this point, Square was just cranking out the Final Fantasy games about once a year. In 2000, Final Fantasy IX came out, and just barely over a year later, in November of 2001, Final Fantasy X hit North American shores, having come out in Japan in July 2001. So it was like a year in between 9 and 10. So they really knew what they were doing at this point. I think this is really impressive because there's actually not a whole lot that was transferable from game to game in terms of like art assets or anything. Like from 7 to 8 to 9, they're all fairly different visual styles, and even into 10 as well. And then you've got Final Fantasy X being released on the PS2, so there's probably even less work of the technical work that can be brought over. So they probably had to start practically from scratch just to make Final Fantasy X. So it's just impressive they were able to do it a year after 9 came out.
Yeah, they're just flying. This is now that we're getting to the point though where they're big budget teams building games. So
yeah, there were 100 people. Yeah, Final Fantasy X had 100 people working on it, so which was huge at the time for a development team. So the turnaround time from the start of development to release was pretty impressive. So they started working on the game in 1999 during the development of Final Fantasy IX. Then they presented it in 2000 at the Square Millennium event, where they also had Final Fantasy IX and Final Fantasy XI. So like at this point, they had greenlit. They were like, once 7 was a success, they were like, okay, we're making an 8, we're making a 9, we're making a 10, and we're making an 11. Let's get to work. And so they really crushed it at this point in time. They were just cranking out the Final Fantasies. So, yeah,
and you loved it.
I loved it. This game's awesome. This one follows yet another ragtag group of misfits on a quest to save the world. The game starts out in a place called Zanarkand, where our star athlete Tidus, and it is Tidus, not Titus, is playing a rousing game of blitzball, which is an underwater sport where the ball has to be thrown into a goal. It's neat. It takes place in a giant sphere of water that I'm really not sure of the physics and how that works, but you know,
hey, it's fantasy cool and it's final.
Yeah, it's cool looking. So during that game, there's a giant monster that attacks Zanarkand, and Tidus wakes up in a world called Spira. He doesn't know anything about what's going on, but he does know one thing. He knows blitzball. And luckily, the people of Spira also play blitzball. So that's helpful for him. Tidus meets Yuna, a young summoner who's on a journey to defeat a giant monster called Sin by doing a summoning ritual. So every now and then, Sin comes back, and the summoners have to go to wherever Sin is and do the thing so that he goes away. So nobody here knows anything about Tidus' home of Zanarkand. He's like, I'm from Zanarkand. And they're like, oh, you mean that place that got destroyed 1,000 years ago? So it's like, what? Was he sent forward in the future? What's going on here? So since he doesn't have anything better to do, he decides to join Yuna and her party on her journey to perform the summoning ritual. They fall in love, plot twists happen, and eventually you end up fighting another god by the end of the game, of course.
Dude, so this one involves like some time travel baloney. Mm-hmm. It's getting real.
Yeah. There's some weird baloney that happens in this game, but it's all classic Final Fantasy. So
very Final Fantasy. I like it. It seems fun. Also, I want to know what blitzball. How you play blitzball?
Yeah,
is it like underwater water polo?
Kind of. Yeah. They just like throw the ball. I don't know. I didn't really like the mini game. This game also had a mini game. So like 8 had Triple Triad, 9 had Tetramaster, 10 had blitzball, and I just couldn't care less about it. So I never really played it.
Yeah, I'm spending a lot of time on the Final Fantasy wiki right now to see these, so don't even worry about it. I got you.
All right.
I'll be looking it up myself later.
This story is one of my favorite Final Fantasy stories because it was the first Final Fantasy with voice acting. So they recorded and animated a ton of cutscenes, and this really brought the story to life. Like every cutscene is voiced in this game. It's awesome. So the player did lose the ability to name their party members since, you know, that the names have to be spoken in the cutscenes now instead of just read. But you can still rename the main character whose name is never spoken throughout the entire game, which is a little weird.
They never say, hey, Tidus.
No, because you can name him anything. So they just don't speak his name ever.
That's a bummer.
Yeah. So the world, though, is like bright and colorful, and a lot of the areas have this really cool tropical influence that makes the game super fun to play, and that's juxtaposed against like this really dark storyline that deals a lot with death and like people finding peace in the afterlife and stuff like that. So it's really interesting because of that. There's no more world map, and the overworld sections aren't like 2D like pre-rendered backgrounds with a 3D model running over it. They're fully 3D, so it like feels like a next generation game too. The random battles, awesome. Yeah. So the random battles are still there, so be ready to be interrupted all the time to check out this brand new battle system, which is pretty cool. So the battle system in Final Fantasy X is a pretty radical departure from older games. They've thrown out the ATB system in favor of the CTB system, which is the conditional turn-based battle system. So this system is purely turn-based. There's no more like waiting for bars to fill up and then doing your attack. Instead, on the right side of the screen, you have the 8 next turns are listed, like who's going to be going. So it'll be like your party member, then this party member, then the boss, and that kind of stuff, which sort of allowed you to plan ahead. But as you use abilities, some of them will affect turn order. So before you use the ability, it shows you how the turn order is going to be changed. So it's a cool system that gives you like some, like a little bit of foresight in planning how you want to do your stuff. So you know you're going to get 3 turns before the boss has a thing. So maybe you want to set something up and like do some cool combos.
And can you push the boss's turn farther down?
Yeah, if you do the right stuff.
Oh, that seems really cool. It also seems like it's straight up like this is what they use now, right? Didn't you say it's all CTB now?
No, just this game is CTB.
Oh, just this game. Oh,
Yeah.
So did people not like it?
I think I think people liked it. They just chose to go a different direction. Like 11 is an MMO, so it of course has a completely different battle system. 12 has a system that is similar to 11, so it's like not really turn-based at all. And then 13 has a much different. They're pretty different after this point.
Okay.
So
Well, we'll get into those later.
Yeah,
I'm jumping ahead. I just got so excited by conditionally turn-based battles.
Yeah, we'll get there. We'll get there. But otherwise, the battling is really similar. Each character has their own special abilities, but they can also learn a ton of different abilities thanks to the sphere grid system, which I'll talk about in a minute. So Yuna can also summon various Aeons, is what the summons are called in this game, and they come in and take the place of the party, and they have their own abilities. We got limit breaks again, but this time they're called overdrives, and each character has a bunch of them, and most of them involve some type of input from the player to pull off successfully. Even Yuna's Aeons each have individual overdrives, which can come in handy since those overdrives can be saved and then stored for like big fights. So that's cool.
Yeah, you gotta save that overdrive.
Yeah. Let's talk about progression in this game. The sphere grid. The sphere grid is like really, really different from old games. So characters don't gain levels from experience points. Instead, they gain AP or sphere points. Sorry, SP, I think it's called. Ooh, I can't remember now. But anyway, they gain some experience that grants them sphere levels, and then sphere levels can be spent on the sphere grid, which is like a giant game board that each of the characters has a piece on. Each sphere level allows you to move along that sphere grid, activating spheres for abilities, stat buffs, other stuff like that. So what makes each character unique is their starting point on the sphere grid. So remember, they all share the same board, but they each start in different areas. So your characters will learn like useful, unique moves, but if you want to put in the time to get everybody to max, you can move every single character around the entire sphere grid, and they would all have everything, which is kind of cool, but also a lot of work, and I don't recommend it.
Someone had to have done that before, though, I'm sure.
Oh, right? I'm sure they have, yeah. Most of the re-releases of the game tweak the sphere grid in one way or another, or offer more choice, something like that, like the HD remakes. So FF10 was received pretty well, I think. It didn't quite reach FF7 levels of praise, but people liked it overall, and it sold pretty well. It was a really great early game for the PS2 that showed off what the system was capable of. All of the PS1 Final Fantasy games had been 3 or 4 discs long, but thanks to next-generation DVD technology in the PS2, Final Fantasy X was able to fit on just a single DVD, and that's with all of the cutscenes being voiced. Are you kidding me?
Wow.
Technology. Man, technology.
We're truly in a space age right now.
We really are. So this one game also had a ton of great looking CG, like full motion video sequences, like the other ones. This one probably had definitely had the best up to this point. It also had a scene that's a little bit notorious in the gaming community, which is the laugh scene between Tidus and Yuna. And I'm going to have you roll a clip here, Mike, that I will give to you.
You probably shouldn't laugh anymore.
Yeah, so that sounds pretty bad, but this scene makes a lot of sense in context, okay? I'm going to explain it real quick. In this scene, Yuna's talking to Tidus about how she and her guardians are this like ray of hope in an otherwise dreary world, and that sometimes she has to pretend to be happy even when she's not happy. So she tells Tidus to force himself to laugh. So he does, and it sounds super forced and really lame. She also forces a laugh, and it's actually like a really sweet scene with two people doing these like ridiculous laughs and being vulnerable with each other. But people like to pull this scene and be like, look how bad the voice acting in this game is. These are unrealistic laughs. And you're like, yeah, that was the point of the scene. So anyway, I just wanted to
understand. You know what? Way to defend that laugh scene. I like it, Tyler.
I just want to defend that scene because I think it gets a bad rap. Anyway, this game didn't have the most lasting impact on the series as a whole. And we're going to see this going forward of like each game like not really affecting the next game very much because they just keep changing. At this point, they change a lot from game to game, which I kind of like about the series, but also makes one question what it means to be a Final Fantasy game. But Final Fantasy X did become the first Final Fantasy game to have a direct sequel in Final Fantasy X-2, which I thought was neat. Well, I mean, the concept of a Final Fantasy sequel, not necessarily the game itself. The game itself follows Yuna, Riku, and a new character called Pain as they travel the world saving people and stuff. The story is a little bit weird and like strangely lighthearted for this world, but I actually really enjoyed the battle system in X-2, which goes back to the ATB days and has a class switching system that I think would influence the battle system in Final Fantasy XIII a bit. It's worth checking out if you're a diehard 10 fan, but if you're not that big of a fan, then don't worry about it. So
yeah,
that's it. That's the 3 Final Fantasy games that I wanted to talk about today. Like I said, I thought we were going to go real deep into like 11 and 12 also, but I don't think we have enough time for that today. So we'll talk about them next week. Or the week after. Who knows?
Or the week after. I think I'm going to cut in. I'm going to do a little cut in next week.
Okay. All right.
And I'm going to do something obscure. I got to find it still, but it's going to be obscure.
Great.
I hope everyone's ready for...
If you've been listening to Codex the past couple weeks going, I don't care about Final Fantasy games, Tyler, stop it. Next week is going to be for you. We're going to take a little bit of a Final Fantasy break, and we'll get Mike in here to do some different stuff.
Jump in something, and I promise it won't be Pokemon. Okay.
Great. But right. I do have a question for you before next week, Mike, and that's what you've been playing.
Oh, well, so I went on the road to a wedding. I traveled to San Diego this week, and the wedding was very nice. But more importantly, yeah, that's right. I said more importantly than the wedding. I brought my Nintendo DS, and I played a lot of Fire Emblem, and it's been good. I'm finally like... I don't know how long Fire Emblem is. I'm in chapter like 14 or 15, so I think I still got a ways to go because it is a JRPG after all, you know. So I have been really enjoying it though, and I've like been messing with more of the systems that I didn't really understand. Like I'm trying not to look things up. Like I'm trying to make mistakes and never go online.
Yeah, because then you ruin the game for yourself, like I ruined Final Fantasy VIII for myself.
Yeah, I did this like reclassing system that I've made. I used a master seal and I've made the like main characters way stronger. And then I also so these guys called Risen rise up on the map, and they're like possessed by an evil spirit thing. And they come up though really low level compared to your party, and I was like, why are they such low level? And I'm like, oh doy, it's because they want me to go back and use these characters I never used to battle them. And so I started doing that, and it's been way more fun, like using these little characters that I have. And just a lot of inventory management. I'm selling a lot of stuff, I'm buying a lot of stuff, because I've decided my new standpoint with gold in games is I'm going to spend it, you know.
All right, yeah, team spend the money. Look, if you lose the game and you still had gold to spend, that's a waste of resources. Can't take it with you, Mike.
Right? It's a total waste, yeah. So I started spending the gold and buying stuff, which is neat. The other thing that I did, though, that I was talking about before, this teaser I did, is so I play Dungeons and Dragons once a week, full nerd spoilers, and I was writing stuff down, and I'm like, this is too much, you know. Like I keep erasing, and the paper looks disgusting. And I had a Kindle Fire tablet I got from my mom. It's an older one. And it was broken. And I thought it was busted. It kept restarting, which I guess is a pretty common problem with these 3rd generation Kindle Fires. And I like deleted all the accounts deleted my account off of it. And there were 2 instances of my account, which I think was the problem. And it's fixed now. And I was just looking on it at Final Fantasy games like 3 days ago.
Ooh.
And they have Final Fantasy games for Kindle. And I'm in the same boat as you right now. I'm trying to justify spending $15 for a Final Fantasy game on a tablet, even though it's a full game. Like the
game is worth it, but it's like this weird well, I'm like conditioned that apps should be under $5, right? But it's a full game. Like, would it make you feel better if you bought it and it was sent to you in the mail and it was like on a stick you put in your tablet? It's like, I'm like, yeah, that would make me feel better. But why would that make you feel better? That's objectively worse.
Yeah, right. It's just so weird. And I don't even think the app, because it's an older game, these Final Fantasy games, so the app's not even that big.
Yeah, it's just a couple
for
gigs
the whole
probably.
game.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like, I'm just trying to justify it right now. So we'll see next week if I take the plunge. I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of trying to torn too, because I'm like, I want to also play KOTOR again, and those are also on tablets. But is it a tablet game, or do I want something I can sit down on my Xbox and just play through? You know,
that's a great question.
Yeah, I've been playing a lot of Apex also because Season 2 came out, and that's been fun. But Tyler, what have you been playing?
Man, this past week, the new expansion for Final Fantasy XIV came out, Shadowbringers. So I'm all aboard the Final Fantasy train. I didn't play the last expansion, so I bought the new one, and then I paid to skip the story stuff from the last expansion, which I don't like doing, but I want to catch up to my friends. But now I'm like not high enough level to start the story of the new stuff, and so like it's like, oh, do I pay to boost to 70 to like the level that I need to be, or do I just play it out? And I think I'm going to play it out because the level boost it costs a lot of money, and I'm like, I don't need to spend $100 on this game in total. So I paid to skip the story, and then hopefully I'll be able to. I think they're coming out with an ability to go back and replay old story stuff, like actually play through it, not just watch the cutscenes like you've been able to. So I'm hoping I'll get to go back and play the old story. But man, this game is getting such good reviews. Like the storyline is supposed to be so good, and it's just like there are people saying like, oh, this is the best Final Fantasy storyline, like just full stop. Not even like, oh, the best storyline in an MMO or the best whatever. It's like, nope, it's the best Final Fantasy storyline. So I'm getting stoked and excited, but I need to do all my dailies and stuff so that I can get to level 70 quickly.
I see. Oh, also, I forgot to mention too, but Destiny added a new thing today.
Oh week. Yeah, I've been neglecting my Destiny duties as well. So
yeah, they've had they added the Moments of Triumph for this year, and then they also added the Tribute Hall, which is this weird like you add these statues to a hall to like show like what you've accomplished. Really, it's like you got to spend a lot of resources to get these statues, but and you can get like discounts by doing these bounties every day. But the discounts are really small. It's like 1% discount.
Do they stack? So the more bounties you do, the more percent discount.
So, but I've only done like 7 of 80. So
okay.
Yeah, it's 4 a day. So I'm thinking 20 days you get all of them done. But it's been really good, and yeah, I mean, there's so much to do. There's like Menagerie still, and I kind of figured out, like I looked up weapon recipes on Menagerie, so I was getting like all of the opulence weapons, which is nice. And I learned that to get all the opulence armor, you have to have blue runes unlocked, so that's like the last thing. So I'm trying to save up Imperials.
Yeah, I gotta unlock more
runes.
stuff on my.
Yeah. But it's really fun. It's just a lot of playing, you know, Yep. And I was gone the last like 4 days, which was a big chunk of my usual playtime. So it's like there's that stupid Spoilers of War bounty that I still haven't done, and I have it in my inventory and it expires in a day. And I'm like, am I gonna be able to do this in a day? Because it takes so long.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, it's been really fun. I'm really enjoying it myself. I think you are. I mean, it's a good time for video games right now. There's a lot to do.
It really is.
Which is weird because summertime, it usually slows down.
Yeah.
It slows down a lot. But as always, if you want to find Tyler and I on Twitter, he's at SneakerElf, ELPH. I am at Mecoletta, MECOLETTA. You can add us on that. You can email us at codexhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can rate and review and subscribe to us on wherever you listen to us, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and just tell your friends about the show, and that would mean the world to us. So thank you so much for listening. And next week we're going to probably do a little something different, take a little break from Final Fantasy, and then we'll jump right back into it.
Cool.
So we're going to jump back into it at the MMO part, which is kind of a big thing.
I love me some MMOs.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, until next time, I'll talk to you later. Bye, everybody.
Goodbye.